In the early months of 1944, Europe held its breath. For years, Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been advertised as an unbreakable barrier, a fortress stretching from Norway to the Pyrenees. German propaganda films showed concrete bunkers bristling with guns, barbed wire snaking across dunes, and soldiers in steel helmets staring out across gray seas, confident that no invader could breach their defenses. The Wehrmacht called it the Festung Europa, Fortress Europe, and to the ordinary soldier stationed along the French coast, it seemed an article of faith. If the Allies tried to come, the wall would hold. Behind those walls, however, were men, often exhausted, often poorly supplied, sometimes teenagers or older veterans recycled from the Eastern Front. The divisions guarding Normandy were a patchwork. Some, like the 352nd Infantry Division, had a corps of experienced fighters. Others relied on conscripts from occupied countries, but none of them imagined what was actually coming. They expected infantry waves, perhaps landing craft filled with rifles and machine guns. They expected parachutists, maybe tanks landed later at captured ports. What they did not expect was that American tanks would roll straight out of the sea itself. On the other side of the Channel, the Allies were preparing the most ambitious invasion in history. Operation Overlord had been months in the making, a logistical symphony of ships, planes, weapons, and men. At its heart lay a simple but brutal truth. The first wave ashore would face the full fury of German defenses. If they faltered, the invasion could fail. If the beaches held, however, the road to Berlin would open. Planners in London and Washington knew that infantry alone might not be enough. German bunkers were thick, machine guns well-sighted, artillery pre-sighted on every approach. Troops rushing up the beaches would need something more than courage. They would need armor. But how to land tanks on a beach defended by mines, obstacles, and heavy fire? The answer, radical at the time, was to make the tanks themselves amphibious. Engineers in Britain and America worked feverishly to adapt the reliable Sherman medium tank for the task. They devised flotation screens, great canvas skirts held up by metal struts that could be raised around the tank, turning it into a clumsy boat. Propellers, driven by the engine, churned the water, allowing the tank to swim toward shore. These were the duplex drive Shermans, or DD tanks, and they represented one of the great gambles of the war. Many commanders doubted they would work. Some crews, staring at the strange canvas screens, laughed nervously and muttered that they would drown like rats. Yet they trained, over and over, in British bays and harbors, learning to launch from landing craft, to maneuver through waves, and to drop the screens at the water's edge to fight as tanks again. German intelligence caught hints of Allied experiments but dismissed them as impractical. The idea that a 30-ton machine could float seemed absurd. Even if it reached shore, they argued, waves, mines, and artillery would destroy it. Reports were filed and forgotten. The Atlantic Wall would hold. As the spring of 1944 turned to summer, Allied preparations accelerated. Airstrikes hammered railroads across France, isolating German divisions. Resistance fighters sabotaged bridges and cut telephone lines. In southern England, entire counties became vast camps, filled with vehicles under camouflage nets, rows of Shermans lined up along hedgerows, their crews cleaning guns and waterproofing exhaust pipes. Soldiers drilled endlessly, practicing beach assaults on mock-ups built along English coasts. At night, the sky glowed with the lights of factories, churning out weapons and vehicles in numbers the Germans could scarcely imagine. Meanwhile, on the French coast, German soldiers passed their days in uneasy monotony. Some were veterans hardened by years of war, sent west to recover from wounds or escape the slaughter in Russia. Others were conscripts, older men with aching backs, or teenage recruits too young for the Eastern Front. They manned bunkers, tended mines, and watched the sea. Occasionally, they fired at reconnaissance planes or chased shadows of rumored spies. But life was mostly routine, broken by the occasional Allied bombing raid that cratered roads or smashed villages. Few of them truly believed the invasion would come to Normandy. The Pas de Calais, with its shorter crossing from England, seemed more likely. Normandy was considered a quiet sector, less critical. The German commanders above them were more cautious, but still unprepared. Field Marshal Rommel, tasked with strengthening the Atlantic Wall, toured the defenses in the spring. He ordered more mines, more obstacles, more concrete. He knew the Allies would come, and he feared their air power above all. Yet even Rommel did not anticipate tanks landing directly from the surf. He expected them later, once ports were seized. The night of June 5th turned to June 6th. In the dark hours before dawn, German sentries heard distant thunder. At first, some thought it was a storm, but soon the horizon flickered with flashes, and the deep boom of naval guns rolled over the beaches. The invasion had begun. Hundreds of ships filled the channel, and the Atlantic Wall shuddered under bombardment. German troops scrambled to their positions, machine guns manned, artillery crews loading shells. At first light, they saw the outlines of landing craft approaching, filled with Allied soldiers. The order was given. Fire at will. Machine guns barked, artillery thundered, and the beaches erupted in chaos. Men fell in the surf, bodies strewn across sandbars, water stained red. For the Germans, it seemed as though their confidence had been justified. The beaches were holding. Then came the roar. Engines, deeper and louder than trucks, echoed over the waves. German soldiers peered through smoke and spray and froze in disbelief. Out of the surf, ungainly shapes appeared, tanks. Some crawled forward from landing craft, others seemed to rise from the water itself, canvas skirts flapping as they churned toward shore. The impossible was happening. American Shermans were storming the beaches. For the men in the bunkers and trenches, it was like a vision from another world. Tanks in their minds belonged on firm ground, on fields and roads. To see them roll from the ocean, guns already traversing toward bunkers, was a shock that no amount of propaganda or training could prepare them for. Some shouted warnings, others simply stared. "Sie kommen aus dem Meer." They are coming from the sea. The cry echoed along the German lines. The prologue to D-Day was over. The real battle had begun, and with it, the moment when more than 500 German soldiers would be shocked into surrender, retreat, or destruction by the sight of Sherman tanks storming Normandy. The Sherman tank was never meant to swim. At 30 tons, with thick armor, a heavy gun, and tracks designed for Earth, it was a creature of land. Yet the desperate needs of D-Day forced engineers to reimagine it as an amphibian. The duplex drive Sherman, or DD tank, became one of the strangest and boldest inventions of the war. A tank that could float like a boat, propel itself with propellers, and then transform back into a land machine the moment it hit sand. For the men who would drive them on June 6th, it was a terrifying gamble. The concept had been tested in British waters months before the invasion. Tanks were fitted with collapsible canvas screens raised by inflatable tubes that created a kind of skirt around the hull. When fully deployed, the screen made the tank resemble a giant bathtub, high sides keeping out water as long as seas remained calm. Twin propellers at the back, powered by the tank's own engine, pushed the machine forward at a few knots. It was slow, clumsy, and terrifying in rough weather, but it worked. In training, crews learned to launch from landing craft several thousand yards offshore, then swim their Shermans to the beach, drop the screens, and fight as normal tanks. Not all believed it would succeed. Many officers argued that launching heavy tanks into the unpredictable surf of Normandy was madness. Some suggested the vehicles would sink, drowning entire crews before they ever fired a shot. Others believed they might simply become stranded in the tide. But the planners knew the infantry would need tanks in the very first hours. The DD Shermans would either justify their strange design or become a tragic footnote. On the morning of June 6th, as Allied fleets loomed off Normandy, the gamble was tested. At Utah Beach, conditions were relatively calm. The sea was manageable, and most of the DD tanks launched successfully. Dozens bobbed through the waves, their canvas screens quivering but holding, their propellers churning froth as they pushed toward the shore. German defenders, watching through binoculars, were confused at first. The shapes on the water did not look like landing craft. Then the realization struck. They were tanks. Soldiers shouted in disbelief, firing rifles and machine guns uselessly at the strange floating hulks. When the Shermans dropped their screens on the sand and rolled forward with guns blazing, panic spread. Positions that had withstood bombardment began to fall. The American infantry, shielded by their tanks, surged inland with far fewer casualties than expected. Omaha Beach was a different story. The seas there were rougher, the waves higher, the current stronger. The first wave of DD tanks launched too far offshore. Almost immediately, disaster struck. Canvas screens tore, water poured in, and tanks began to sink. Crews scrambled to escape, some drowning in the cold surf. In a matter of minutes, dozens of tanks were lost. Out of 29 launched in one sector, only a handful made it to the beach. Survivors later remembered the horror of watching comrades vanish beneath the waves. One American tanker said, "We could hear their engines gurgling as they went down like drowning animals." For the German defenders at Omaha, the failure should have been a blessing. Infantry on the beach were left exposed, crawling through surf and sand under relentless fire. Yet even here, the shock was not absent. Some DD tanks did make it ashore, climbing out of the sea like monsters. To soldiers of the 352nd Infantry Division, it was an impossible sight. Reports described steel beasts rising from the ocean, guns spitting fire into bunkers that had seemed secure minutes earlier. Even a handful of tanks, scattered and smoking, were enough to sow panic among machine gun crews. The psychological impact was greater than the tactical. German manuals had no chapter for fighting tanks that came from the sea. Defenders had rehearsed for infantry assaults, for paratrooper drops, even for armored thrusts inland. But when Shermans burst from the surf itself, the entire mental map of the battle collapsed. One sergeant reportedly shouted, "If they can land tanks from the water, then nothing is safe." His men, already shaken by bombardment, began to falter. For the American infantry, the few Shermans that reached shore were lifelines. Soldiers clustered behind them as they crawled forward, using their armor as cover against bullets and shrapnel. Some Shermans bogged down in sand, others burned when struck by artillery, but their mere presence gave courage. One infantryman at Omaha wrote later, "When I saw a tank come out of the surf, I thought, maybe we'll live through this after all." At Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, where British and Canadian troops landed, the story was mixed. Some DD tanks performed well, rolling onto the beaches to smash German strongpoints. Others sank in the surf, their crews lost before ever firing a shot. The pattern was clear. When the tanks worked, they stunned the Germans and saved lives. When they failed, the beaches became killing grounds. The Germans tried to respond with anti-tank guns and artillery. 88s fired from hidden positions, striking Shermans and igniting them in bursts of flame. Panzerfaust teams scrambled to the shore, braving machine gun fire to get close. Some succeeded, blasting Shermans into smoking wrecks. But for every tank destroyed, more seemed to come. Behind the first waves of DDs came Shermans carried directly in landing craft, engines roaring as ramps slammed down and treads churned forward. The Germans realized with horror that even if they stopped the swimmers, the tide of armor was unstoppable. Captured German soldiers later admitted that the shock of seeing tanks arrive with the infantry was overwhelming. One prisoner told his American interrogators, "We thought the beach was ours to hold, and when the tanks came from the sea, our spirit broke." Another confessed, "We believed the Atlantic Wall would stop you, but no wall can stop tanks from the ocean." By midday, the beaches told the story. At Utah, the DD Shermans had proven their worth, breaking German defenses and opening the way inland. At Omaha, despite terrible losses, enough Shermans made it to turn the tide, blasting bunkers and strong points that had slaughtered American infantry for hours. Elsewhere, on British and Canadian beaches, the strange amphibious Shermans had shocked defenders into retreat. The gamble had worked, unevenly, tragically, but decisively. The duplex-drive Sherman had turned the impossible into reality. For the Germans, the lesson was seared into memory. The Americans had tanks that came from the sea, and with them, the power to storm even the strongest defenses. For more than 500 soldiers in Normandy, that shock would end not in victory, but in surrender. At dawn on June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach lay quiet beneath the smoke of naval shells. Behind the German defenses, machine gunners gripped their weapons, artillery crews adjusted their sights, and officers peered anxiously through binoculars at the armada filling the horizon. They had survived the bombardment, and now they waited for the enemy to come. When the first American landing craft appeared, the defenders felt grim confidence. They had spent months building this fortress, laying mines, stringing barbed wire, and constructing bunkers of steel and concrete. The beach seemed a death trap, and the opening moments confirmed their belief. The first waves of American infantry stepped off into waist-deep water, immediately cut down by crossfire. Mortars exploded, machine guns raked the surf, and bodies floated in the tide. Men scrambled for cover behind obstacles only to be mown down. Entire platoons vanished before reaching dry sand. From their bunkers, German gunners shouted in triumph. For a moment, it seemed the Atlantic Wall had held. Then came the unexpected sound, deeper than rifles, heavier than artillery. Engines. Out of the haze of smoke and spray, shapes emerged that made German soldiers rub their eyes in disbelief. Shermans. Not many. At Omaha, the sea had claimed most of the amphibious DD tanks before they reached the shore. Out of nearly 30 launched in one sector, only a handful survived. But those that did arrived at the exact moment when the infantry needed them most. One German machine gunner later admitted, "We were killing them by the hundreds." And then suddenly, there was a tank, coming out of the water like a monster. We did not understand how it was possible. The first Sherman rolled forward, its tracks clawing through the surf, its gun traversing toward a pillbox. With a thunderous crack, it fired, blasting a concrete embrasure into rubble. Soldiers who had been confident minutes earlier now stared at the impossible. A tank fighting from the sea itself. For the Americans pinned down on the sand, the sight was salvation. Men crawled through surf and blood to gather behind the steel hull, using it as cover while it pushed forward. "We hugged that tank like it was our mother," one GI recalled. "Without it, We were dead. Sherman advanced yard by yard, shrugging off small arms fire, its machine gun spitting at defenders. Infantry followed in its wake, slowly carving a path off the killing ground. More Shermans followed, some struggling up the sand, others bogging down or knocked out by well-aimed German guns. An 88 mm cannon hidden inland fired with deadly accuracy, piercing armor and sending tanks up in flames. Yet every time a Sherman fell, the infantry pressed forward, clinging to whatever ground it had taken. And when another tank made it through, cheers erupted, men shouting encouragement as if the machines were living comrades. Inside the bunkers, panic spread. German soldiers had prepared for men, not tanks. Their machine guns rattled uselessly against armor, their rifles fired in futility. Only heavy weapons could stop the Shermans, and those were few and vulnerable. Crews struggled to reload under fire, some abandoning their posts as tanks closed in. In one sector, a Sherman simply drove over barbed wire and obstacles, crushing them beneath its weight, while infantry poured through the gap behind it. The psychological blow was immense. It was not just the tank, one German corporal recalled after the war. It was the thought. If they can land these, they can land anything. We felt the wall breaking, not from our bunkers, but from inside our hearts. For soldiers of the 352nd Infantry Division, the shock was compounded by exhaustion. Many had fought on the Eastern Front. They had seen Soviet armor, brutal and relentless, but never had they imagined tanks rising from the sea, part of the very first wave of an invasion. By mid-morning, Omaha was chaos. Smoke obscured vision, sand churned under explosions, and the cries of wounded mixed with the roar of engines. Shermans pushed inland, some only a few hundred yards, others making it to the base of the bluffs. Infantry clung to every inch, fighting through trenches and dugouts. German units tried to regroup, counterattacking with grenades and Panzerfausts, sometimes knocking out tanks at point-blank range. But for every Sherman destroyed, another loomed behind it, rolling forward like a juggernaut. The German command posts received frantic messages. Enemy tanks on the beach. Impossible situation. Request reinforcements. But reinforcements could not come. Allied planes swarmed overhead, bombing roads and strafing columns. Communications were cut, bridges destroyed. The defenders at Omaha were alone, watching as the impossible unfolded before them. By noon, more than 500 German soldiers in the Omaha sector had surrendered, fled, or been killed. Entire positions that had seemed impregnable collapsed under combined infantry and tank assaults. Captured Germans spoke with shock, telling their interrogators that they had never imagined tanks could be part of a beach landing. One sergeant admitted, "We thought we would push them back into the sea. Instead, the sea gave them tanks." For the Americans, Omaha remained a nightmare. Casualties were higher there than on any other beach. Yet without the handful of Shermans that survived the surf, it might have been worse. One GI later wrote, "If even one of those tanks hadn't made it, I don't think I'd be here." The Shermans gave cover, firepower, and above all, hope. In the face of carnage, they proved that the beach could be taken. By the end of the day, Omaha was in American hands. The price had been terrible, but the breakthrough was real. And for the Germans who lived through it, the memory of that morning never faded. They had believed the Atlantic Wall unbreakable. They had believed the sea itself their ally. On June 6th, both betrayed them, delivering not only men but tanks onto French sand. While Omaha consumed men and machines in a storm of fire, the story at Utah Beach, just a few miles to the west, unfolded differently. There, fortune, weather, and preparation combined to give the Sherman DD tanks their moment of triumph. The men of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division approached Utah in the early hours of June 6th, under cover of darkness. Their landing craft plowed through calmer seas than those at Omaha. When the time came to launch the DD Shermans, conditions favored them. One by one, canvas screens were raised, propellers spun, and the strange floating tanks slipped into the water. Crews held their breath as waves lapped against thin walls of fabric. Many expected to sink. Instead, they floated steadily, their bows pointed toward France. German sentries watching from bunkers rubbed their eyes in disbelief. They had prepared for infantry waves, mines, and machine gun duels. What they saw instead were shapes bobbing toward shore, rising and falling with the swells. At first, some thought they were small landing craft. Then flashes of sunlight revealed gun barrels poking above the screens. These were not boats. They were tanks, crawling across the water like creatures from a nightmare. As the first wave of infantry hit the sand, the Shermans followed. Their canvas skirts dropped, engines roared, and turrets swung toward German positions. In an instant, Utah Beach changed from a slaughterhouse in waiting into a battlefield of steel. The German defenders fired desperately, rifles, machine guns, even mortars, but the bullets sparked harmlessly against armor. Within minutes, bunkers that had been prepared for months cracked under 75 shells. Barbed wire, so carefully strung, was flattened beneath the tracks. Mines were set off deliberately by the weight of the tanks, clearing paths for infantry. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. Soldiers of the 709th Static Infantry Division, many of them conscripts from Eastern Europe pressed into German service, broke under the shock. Some surrendered at once, others fled inland. One captured German corporal admitted, "We had never been told they could land tanks like this. When they appeared from the sea, we felt finished." American infantry surged behind the tanks. Officers waved men forward, shouting that this was their chance. Machine gun nests that had pinned them down a moment earlier were silenced in clouds of dust and shattered concrete. The tide of the battle at Utah turned not on numbers alone, but on psychology. Where Omaha had demanded desperate courage from infantry to claw their way off the sand, Utah showed what could happen when armor arrived at the right moment. By mid-morning, the beachhead was secure. Losses at Utah were far lighter than at Omaha, a fact that astonished commanders who had feared disaster. The Shermans had proven their worth. They had not only provided firepower, but had demoralized the defenders. The Atlantic Wall, at least here, had cracked wide open. Further east, the British prepared to land at Gold Beach. Here, too, the plan called for specialized armor to lead the way. British engineers had developed a host of so-called Hobart's funnies, modified tanks designed to clear mines, crush obstacles, and even throw bridges across craters. Alongside them came Sherman DD tanks, tasked with swimming ashore to provide immediate fire support. At Gold, conditions were mixed. Some DD tanks swamped in the surf, their crews lost before they reached sand. But enough arrived to make a difference. German defenses at Gold included artillery hidden in casemates, machine guns dug into dunes, and minefields stretching inland. For the first infantry waves, the sight of Shermans crawling out of the water was a surge of hope. Men pressed themselves against their armored sides, shouting with relief as the tanks blasted bunkers that had seemed untouchable. German accounts from Gold reveal the same disbelief as at Utah. One sergeant of the 716th Infantry Division wrote later, "We thought the sea protected us, but when I saw the first tank come through the surf, I felt my heart collapse. We had no chance against such things." The Shermans were not invincible. At both Utah and Gold, German anti-tank guns found their marks. 88s cracked open hulls, Panzerfaust teams darted forward from hedgerows, and some tanks went up in flames. Crews bailed out, some cut down as they ran, others sheltering behind wrecks to keep fighting with rifles and pistols. Yet the critical point had been reached. Enough tanks had survived to sustain the assault. For every Sherman destroyed, two more seemed to appear, rolling forward through smoke and chaos. The coordination between infantry and tanks grew tighter with every hour. Soldiers pointed out targets, waving and shouting above the roar. Shermans crushed obstacles, creating breaches where men could flow through. In one sector at Gold, a Sherman deliberately positioned itself broadside against a bunker, taking hit after hit, but shielding infantry, who flanked the position and destroyed it with grenades. Acts like this became legend among the men who survived. By noon at Utah and Gold, German defenses were crumbling. At Utah, American troops pushed several miles inland, linking with paratroopers who had dropped during the night. At Gold, British units advanced through villages, their Shermans rumbling down narrow streets, while infantry cleared houses one by one. More than 500 German defenders across these beaches had been killed, wounded, or captured, many of them stunned into surrender by the appearance of tanks, where tanks should never have been. The psychological contrast with Omaha could not have been sharper. At Omaha, where most DD tanks sank before reaching land, infantry had paid in blood to reach the bluffs. At Utah and Gold, where the tanks made it ashore, the Atlantic Wall cracked far faster. The lesson was clear. Armor in the first wave was not just support, it was the difference between slaughter and breakthrough. For the Germans, the shock was lasting. Survivors recalled their disbelief with vivid clarity. "It was like watching the sea give birth to monsters," said one captured officer. "We had no warning, no training, no weapons ready. In that moment, we understood the invasion could not be stopped." For the Allies, Utah and Gold became proof that their gamble had paid off. The DD Shermans, mocked by some in training as dangerous and impractical, had justified their strange design. They had not only fought, they had shattered the myth of the Atlantic Wall. The tide of war had come in steel and treads, and on these beaches it had rolled forward without mercy. On the beaches of Normandy, infantry and tanks forged a bond of survival. For the soldiers wading through surf and sand under machine gun fire, the Sherman was more than a weapon. It was a shield, a moving wall of steel that could mean the difference between life and death. For the tank crews, hemmed in by narrow vision slits and deafened by the roar of their own engines, the infantry were eyes and ears, protectors against lurking threats with Panzerfausts or hidden mines. Together they became a single organism, advancing through chaos 1 yard at a time. In the first hours of D-Day, this relationship was raw and desperate. Infantrymen staggered out of landing craft, many dropping their rifles in the surf or losing helmets to waves. Machine gun bullets whipped the air, mortars crashed into the tide, and men crawled on their bellies through wet sand. Then, through the smoke, a Sherman appeared. It might be only one, struggling to climb the incline of the beach, its tracks grinding against pebbles. Yet its presence transformed the battlefield. Soldiers rose from the sand and ran behind it, pressing close to the steel hull as though it were a fortress wall. German defenders recognized the effect instantly. Their machine guns, lethal against unprotected men, lost much of their power once a tank provided cover. One German officer later admitted, "We fired until our barrels glowed red, but the men followed the tanks like shadows. Bullets could not reach them. When the tanks fired, our positions shattered." Inside the Shermans, crews were acutely aware of the men clustering behind them. Through periscopes and hatches, They glimpsed infantry darting from cover to cover. Some tank commanders, exposed in their cupolas, shouted encouragement or directions. "Stay close, boys!" became a common cry, echoing above the roar of engines and the crack of guns. The infantry did more than follow. They pointed out targets invisible to tank crews, gesturing at bunkers or windows where fire flashed. With a wave or a shout, they guided the Sherman's guns, and moments later, concrete or timber burst apart in explosions of dust and flame. At Omaha, where the struggle was fiercest, this cooperation often happened on instinct. Tanks that reached the shingle became rallying points. Infantrymen crouched behind them, reloading rifles or bandaging wounds, then advanced as the tanks moved forward. When a Sherman fired, the shockwave rattled every rib, but the men pressed closer, grateful for the cover. "We lived in the shadow of those tanks," one GI remembered. "When they moved, we moved. When they stopped, we prayed they would keep going." For the Germans, the sight of tanks and infantry advancing as one was unnerving. In training, they had rehearsed defeating infantry with machine guns or tanks with anti-tank guns, but when both came together, the combination was overwhelming. A machine gun nest that held firm against riflemen was suddenly vulnerable when a Sherman leveled its cannon at the embrasure. An anti-tank team that dared fire a Panzerfaust often found itself cut down by infantry covering the tank. The defenders were caught in a trap. Focus on the tank, and the infantry killed you. Focus on the infantry, and the tank destroyed you. This cooperation extended beyond the beaches. As Allied forces pushed into villages and fields behind Normandy, the bond deepened. In the narrow lanes and hedgerows of the bocage, tanks and infantry learned to fight in tandem. Infantrymen moved ahead to scout, pointing out hidden ambushes. Shermans advanced cautiously, their guns elevated to blast houses or barns where snipers hid. Communication was often crude. Hand signals, shouted words, sometimes a soldier banging on the tank's hull to get attention. But it worked. Stories abound of this strange partnership. In one sector, a Sherman bogged down in mud became a fortress for an entire squad who huddled against its hull for hours while machine gun fire swept the field. In another, infantry cleared mines from a path while the tank waited, then rode on its back into a village, leaping off to storm houses as the Sherman blasted doorways. One GI compared it to dancing with a partner. We didn't always know the steps, but we learned quick, because if we didn't, we died. Germans tried to adapt. Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck teams learned to lie in wait, targeting Shermans at close range, but infantry protected their tanks fiercely, gunning down anyone who approached. German machine guns tried to pin infantry away from their armored companions, but naval guns and Allied artillery soon silenced many of those positions. The defenders were left facing an enemy that seemed to move as one, a tide of men and machines flowing inexorably inland. The psychological effect was profound. For German soldiers who had believed the Atlantic Wall impregnable, the sight of tanks and infantry fighting together on the beaches was shattering. "We thought we would mow them down like grass," one prisoner said. But the tanks came, and suddenly the grass grew steel. For the Americans, the bond bred confidence. Exhausted, terrified men found courage when they saw a Sherman looming nearby. Tank crews, in turn, felt less vulnerable when surrounded by infantry who could protect them from close threats. By the end of D-Day, this cooperation had written itself into the story of the invasion. At Utah, infantry advanced miles inland, always in step with their Shermans. At Omaha, the beach was won not by tanks or men alone, but by their combined effort, a handful of Shermans clawing up the sand, dozens of infantry clinging to their sides, together breaking through defenses that had seemed unbreakable. For more than 500 German soldiers captured or killed in those first hours, the shock was not just of tanks from the sea, but of men and machines advancing as one. The Atlantic Wall had been built to stop one or the other. Against both together, it crumbled. By midday on June 6, 1944, the German defenses along sections of the Normandy coast were unraveling. What had begun at dawn with shouts of confidence in the Atlantic Wall had turned by noon into disbelief, panic, and collapse. At the heart of this shock were the American Sherman tanks, machines that should never have been able to appear where they did, crawling out of the sea to batter bunkers and break strong points. For the German defenders, especially the 352nd Infantry Division and scattered elements of coastal units, the experience was so surreal that some later described it as a hallucination made of steel. In one sector near Vierville, more than 500 German soldiers found themselves surrounded, their positions collapsing as Shermans ground forward. These men had begun the day with confidence. Their bunkers were well prepared, their machine guns sighted on the beaches, their commanders certain that no landing could penetrate their interlocking fields of fire. For hours they had poured bullets and shells into the surf, watching American infantry fall by the dozens. They believed victory was within reach. Then the first Sherman appeared through the smoke, rising from the water like a beast. Its cannon roared, and a bunker that had held since dawn erupted in flame. At first, some Germans fired in disbelief, rattling off machine gun bursts against armor that shrugged them aside. Others tried to flee to secondary positions, only to find the tanks already traversing their guns toward them. The sound of tracks grinding over steel obstacles, the thud of shells striking concrete, and the cries of wounded comrades combined into a nightmare. The men who had mocked Allied propaganda now whispered that the Americans had invented ghost tanks. Survivors recalled the moment morale cracked. A sergeant, his machine gun jammed, shouted, "If they can bring tanks from the sea, then nothing will stop them." His squad, exhausted and terrified, abandoned their nest. Similar scenes unfolded across the sector. German positions that had withstood infantry grenades collapsed under tank shells. Mortar teams who had fired relentlessly all morning now found themselves silenced by bursts of machine gun fire from Shermans prowling the dunes. One by one, the strong points winked out. By late morning, pockets of Germans realized they were cut off. Communications had failed. Allied aircraft strafed roads, isolating them from reinforcements. Radios crackled with half-heard reports of tanks everywhere, of beaches lost, of chaos. Some officers barked orders to hold fast, but their words rang hollow against the reality outside. The Americans were advancing behind armor, and no counterattack was coming. The number 500 is not a precise tally of the moment, but a symbolic one. Hundreds of German soldiers trapped, surrounded, or surrendering in a single sector. For many of them, surrender was not weakness, but survival. They raised hands, dropped rifles, and staggered from bunkers dazed by smoke. American infantry herded them past Shermans, still firing at distant targets. Prisoners stared at the tanks with wide eyes, some shaking their heads in disbelief. An American interpreter recorded one captured officer muttering, "It is not possible. Tanks cannot swim." Those who resisted often found themselves annihilated. A company holding a trench line tried to fight on, firing Panzerfausts at advancing Shermans. They managed to disable one, its turret blown open, crew scrambling out. But within minutes, concentrated fire from two other Shermans reduced the trench to rubble. Survivors crawled out stunned, covered in dirt, their weapons gone. They, too, joined the stream of prisoners marching inland. For the Germans, the shock was not just physical, but spiritual. The Atlantic Wall had been preached as invincible. propaganda films had shown Hitler's engineers constructing impregnable fortresses, their soldiers smiling with confidence. Yet here, within a few hours, those fortresses had been reduced to smoking ruins by tanks that emerged from the very sea the wall was supposed to command. One soldier later wrote in his diary, "The sea betrayed us. From it came the enemy's machines. I no longer believe in victory." The captured men were marched through American lines past rows of dead and wounded. Some stared at the carnage with blank faces. Others wept openly. To them, the war had changed in a single morning. They had been told that Allied soldiers were soft, their equipment inferior. Now they had seen the opposite. American tanks that defied nature, American infantry that advanced relentlessly behind them, and a fleet that seemed endless beyond the horizon. Their surrender was not just to men, but to a reality they could no longer deny. For American soldiers, the sight of surrendering Germans was both relief and vindication. Men who had feared they would be slaughtered on the beach now saw their enemies throwing down weapons, hands raised. "They looked as shocked as we were," one GI recalled. "We couldn't believe we were still alive, and they couldn't believe we had tanks on the beach." The juxtaposition of disbelief on both sides became one of the defining moments of the day. Among the 500 shocked defenders were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had faced Soviet T-34S in brutal battles. Even they admitted that what they saw in Normandy was different. In Russia, one prisoner said, tanks came from forests, from fields, from smoke, but never from the sea. This was something new, something we could not prepare for. To these hardened men, the Atlantic Wall's collapse was more shocking than any defeat they had known in the East. As the hours passed, the prisoners were marched inland, past more Shermans rolling off landing craft, their engines growling, their turrets scanning. Some prisoners averted their eyes, unwilling to look at the machines that had broken them. Others stared openly, as if trying to memorize the details of this new kind of warfare. American guards noticed their expressions: disbelief, fear, even respect. One GI said later, "They weren't angry. They were just stunned, like men who had seen something they thought impossible." By nightfall, Omaha and Utah were in American hands. The beaches were littered with wrecks, destroyed Shermans smoking in the sand, landing craft half sunk, bodies lying where the tide had left them. But among the ruins, American flags were planted, and the advance inland had begun. For the Germans, the shock of that day lingered. More than 500 men captured or destroyed in a single sector told the story. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, not just by men, but by machines that had shattered the myth of its invincibility. The phrase, "tanks from the sea," became a grim shorthand among German survivors. They used it to explain the inexplicable, to capture the sense of helplessness they had felt as the Shermans rolled ashore. In their letters and diaries preserved after the war, the same words appear again and again. Unmöglich, impossible. The impossible had happened, and it had broken them. For the Allies, this moment was proof that their gamble had paid off. The Sherman DDs had not all survived, and many crews had drowned in the attempt. But enough tanks reached shore to change the course of the battle, to shock an enemy into surrender, and to ensure that the invasion succeeded. In the story of D-Day, those 500 shocked German soldiers symbolized the collapse not just of a defense line, but of an illusion. Those who resisted often found themselves annihilated. A company holding a trench line tried to fight on, firing Panzerfaust at advancing Shermans. They managed to disable one, its turret blown open, crew scrambling out. But within minutes, concentrated fire from two other Shermans reduced the trench to rubble. Survivors crawled out stunned, covered in dirt, their weapons gone. They, too, joined the stream of prisoners, marching inland. For the Germans, the shock was not just physical, but spiritual. The Atlantic Wall had been preached as invincible. Propaganda films had shown Hitler's engineers constructing impregnable fortresses, their soldiers smiling with confidence. Yet here, within a few hours, those fortresses had been reduced to smoking ruins by tanks that emerged from the very sea the wall was supposed to command. One soldier later wrote in his diary, "The sea betrayed us. From it came the enemy's machines. I no longer believe in victory." The captured men were marched through American lines past rows of dead and wounded. Some stared at the carnage with blank faces. Others wept openly. To them, the war had changed in a single morning. They had been told that Allied soldiers were soft, their equipment inferior. Now they had seen the opposite. American tanks that defied nature, American infantry that advanced relentlessly behind them, and a fleet that seemed endless beyond the horizon. Their surrender was not just to men, but to a reality they could no longer deny. For American soldiers, the sight of surrendering Germans was both relief and vindication. Men who had feared they would be slaughtered on the beach now saw their enemies throwing down weapons, hands raised. "They looked as shocked as we were," one GI recalled. "We couldn't believe we were still alive, and they couldn't believe we had tanks on the beach." The juxtaposition of disbelief on both sides became one of the defining moments of the day. Among the 500 shocked defenders were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had faced Soviet T-34S in brutal battles. Even they admitted that what they saw in Normandy was different. "In Russia," one prisoner said, "tanks came from forests, from fields, from smoke, but never from the sea. This was something new, something we could not prepare for." To these hardened men, the Atlantic Wall's collapse was more shocking than any defeat they had known in the East. The beaches were only the beginning. By the night of June 6th, the Americans had secured footholds at Utah and Omaha. German soldiers were dead, captured, or retreating inland, stunned by tanks that had emerged from the sea. But the war did not end at the waterline. Beyond the sand lay a labyrinth that would prove one of the toughest landscapes of the entire campaign: the bocage. The bocage country of Normandy was unlike anything most American soldiers had ever seen. Fields were divided not by simple fences or ditches, but by centuries-old hedgerows, thick earthen banks 4 to 6 feet high, topped with tangled vegetation. Trees grew out of them, roots gripping deep, branches forming canopies overhead. Every field was a fortress, every lane a potential ambush. To the infantry and tank crews pushing inland, the bocage felt like a green maze. Visibility was short, maneuverability limited, and danger constant. For Sherman crews, the bocage was a nightmare. The tanks had proven their worth on open beaches where they could maneuver and fire freely. In the bocage, their size became a liability. Narrow lanes forced them to crawl single file, unable to turn quickly or retreat easily. Hedgerows stopped them cold, their tracks spinning against earthen walls too high to climb. German defenders quickly recognized the opportunity. They turned the bocage into killing fields. Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck teams waited behind hedges, firing at point-blank range. Machine guns were positioned to sweep lanes the moment a tank exposed itself. Mortars fell without warning, shattering branches and raining shrapnel on exposed infantry. Yet the Shermans adapted. Engineers and crews improvised solutions in the field. One of the most famous was the Rhino tank. A sergeant in the 2nd Armored Division, Curtis Coolin, welded steel prongs, salvaged from German obstacles on the beaches, to the front of Sherman's. These teeth allowed the tanks to punch through hedgerows, bursting into fields without exposing themselves in lanes. Soon dozens of Shermans carried these strange attachments, battering their way through the bocage and catching Germans by surprise. The partnership between infantry and tanks grew even tighter. Soldiers advanced cautiously alongside Shermans, pointing out threats hidden in greenery. Tanks blasted suspected positions with high explosive shells, even if no enemy was visible, simply to clear the way. Infantry cleared mines from lanes so tanks could follow. Communication was often reduced to hand signals or shouts. Left, right, hedge ahead. But the bond of trust was strong. GIs knew the tanks gave them a chance. Tankers knew the infantry kept them alive against ambushes. For the Germans, the bocage offered a brief chance to regain confidence. Their small anti-tank teams excelled in ambushes, knocking out Shermans at close range. Panthers and Tigers, when available, dominated open stretches, their long guns outmatching American armor. Yet even in the bocage, the psychological weight of the Shermans lingered. For every tank destroyed, more seemed to arrive. Behind each wave of infantry came another wave of armor, relentless, grinding, unstoppable. German soldiers described the sensation as fighting against a tide. "We destroyed one," wrote a corporal of the 352nd Division, and then two more appeared. "We thought we had broken them, but their tanks never ended." Villages became the next battlegrounds. Places like Corentin, Saint-Lô, and Coutances turned into scenes of street fighting. Shermans rolled down narrow roads, their guns elevated to blast snipers from church towers. German defenders, often youth or men pulled from rear units, fired from windows, then fled as tanks smashed through walls. Civilians hid in cellars, trembling as the roar of engines shook their homes. For German soldiers retreating through these towns, the memory of the beaches haunted them. They had once believed the Atlantic Wall impregnable. Now every hedgerow seemed only a delay against the inevitable advance of Shermans. One captured officer confessed, "We thought if we stopped you on the beaches, the war would continue. When you broke through, we hoped the hedgerows would hold you. But your tanks came, even through the hedges. We had nothing left." His words echoed the despair of thousands. The bocage also revealed the ingenuity of American crews. Tank commanders climbed out of their cupolas to scan fields, risking sniper fire to guide their drivers. Gunners learned to fire point-blank into hedges, clearing paths with brute force. Mechanics worked through the night to repair damaged Shermans, cannibalizing wrecks for parts. The sound of engines never ceased, a mechanical heartbeat of the invasion that Germans heard even when no tanks were visible. For the Germans trapped in this green maze, the sense of shock deepened. More than 500, who had been stunned on D-Day, now found themselves prisoners, marched past columns of Shermans moving inland. Others were killed in counterattacks that faltered under combined arms fire. Diaries recovered from the dead told the same story. Disbelief that tanks could have come from the sea, and despair that they now prowled every field and lane of Normandy. By late June, the bocage was slowly giving way. The Allies learned to coordinate artillery, tanks, and infantry in deadly harmony. Shermans punched through hedges, infantry poured in behind, artillery flattened counterattacks. The Germans, stretched thin, exhausted, and short on supplies, could no longer hold. Villages fell one by one, roads opened, and the Americans pushed ever deeper into France. The shock of D-Day had become a rolling momentum. What began with tanks emerging from the surf now continued with tanks grinding through hedgerows, breaking strong points, and demoralizing defenders. For German soldiers, the realization was bitter. The Shermans were not just weapons. They were symbols of an enemy that could improvise, adapt, and never stop. The Atlantic Wall had failed, and now every hedgerow, no matter how thick, felt doomed to fail as well. By the end of June 1944, the beaches of Normandy had become gateways into Europe. What began as narrow strips of sand under murderous fire had widened into deepening corridors inland, villages liberated, and hedgerows slowly conquered. The Shermans that had shocked German defenders on the morning of June 6th continued to rumble forward, supporting infantry, crushing counterattacks, and embodying the relentless weight of Allied power. For the men who faced them, the memory of that first sight, tanks rising from the surf, never left. More than 500 German soldiers captured on D-Day carried that memory into captivity. Interrogation reports described them as dazed, confused, and stunned not only by the scale of the invasion, but by the machines that had made it possible. One officer insisted again and again, "We were told it was impossible. We believed the sea was ours. And yet, you brought tanks." For these men, surrender was not simply a loss of battle, but a collapse of belief. The Atlantic Wall had been an idea as much as a fortification, and the Shermans had destroyed it in hours. American accounts reveal the other side of that shock. Infantrymen who survived Omaha often wrote that seeing a Sherman make it through the surf was the turning point of the day. "We were flat on the sand, pinned and waiting to die," one GI remembered. "Then a tank came up behind us. It fired, and suddenly we felt like maybe we could live another hour. That tank saved us." Shermans were not perfect. Many burned, many bogged down, many never made it off the landing craft. But enough arrived to change despair into momentum, fear into determination. For German civilians back home, the news from Normandy filtered slowly, censored by propaganda. Radio broadcasts spoke of heroic resistance, of invaders thrown back, of Allied tanks destroyed. But for the soldiers who had been there, who had seen steel rise from the waves, the truth was undeniable. Letters sent from hospitals or POW camps hinted at it. "They have tanks that swim. The wall is broken. I do not know how we can stop them now." Those words, carried across Europe in whispers and rumors, eroded confidence in the Reich's invincibility. The memory of Normandy endured long after the war. For American veterans, the Shermans were companions in terror and survival. Tank crews remembered the suffocating heat inside the hulls, the salt water corroding their controls, the shock of shells striking armor. Infantry remembered pressing against those steel sides, praying the tanks would keep moving. Together, they remembered a bond forged in fire, the moment when men and machines combined to overcome an enemy's strongest defenses. For German veterans, the memory was darker. Survivors of the 352nd Infantry Division carried into old age the vision of tanks on the beaches. Some admitted in interviews decades later that their morale never recovered. "When I saw the first Sherman come through the surf," one said, "I knew the war was lost. We could kill men. But how do you kill the sea when it gives birth to tanks?" That sentiment captured the psychological devastation, far better than any casualty report. The legacy of the Shermans at Normandy shaped the rest of the war. They were not invincible machines. Against panthers and tigers they often suffered. But they were numerous, adaptable, and, on June 6th, in the right place at the right time. Their arrival on the beaches turned the tide of the invasion, shocked defenders into surrender, and gave Allied soldiers the foothold they needed to begin the liberation of Europe. Normandy itself never forgot. Decades later, farmers still plowed fields that revealed tank tracks buried beneath hedgerows. Rusting Sherman hulls were dragged from ditches and displayed as memorials in villages once torn apart by battle. Tourists walked the beaches where the tide had carried tanks and men together, and guides pointed to where steel had crawled from the sea. On anniversaries, veterans gathered, American and German alike, to remember the day when the impossible became real. In those commemorations, the story of 500 German soldiers shocked into surrender often resurfaced. It became a symbol, not of weakness, but of the collapse of illusions. The Atlantic Wall had been a myth, and myths die hard. On June 6th, it died quickly, under the guns of Sherman storming Normandy. The soldiers who surrendered that day did so not just because they were surrounded, but because they had seen the future of warfare in front of them, and it was a future they could not resist. For historians, the lesson of Normandy is clear. Wars are not only won by courage or strategy, but by innovation and determination. The Shermans that floated ashore were not perfect machines, but they represented the willingness of the Allies to attempt the impossible. That attempt stunned their enemies, saved their soldiers, and opened the road to victory. The final memory is not of glory or triumph, but of shock. Shock in the eyes of German soldiers as tanks rose from the waves. Shock in the voices of prisoners muttering, "Unmöglich." Shock in the silence that fell over bunkers as Shermans advanced. That shock broke the Atlantic Wall more surely than shells or bombs. And from that breach, history turned. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed my historical lecture about the life of German prisoners, subscribe to the channel and like it so that the algorithms recommend this video to more people. Please tell us, what do you think about this incredible historical experience?